Welcome to the latest episode of Close Readings. In this series, we're looking each time at a single poem, which we've chosen because it seems in one way or another political, either an expression of its author's political views, or a response to a political event, or in some other way. My name is Seamus Perry, and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic, and Professor of English at University College London. And today's poem, Mark, I guess, is political in several ways, but most immediately it is a response to a political event, and a political event that was immediately seen to be of the very greatest consequence, which was the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., at Ford's Theatre in April 1865. And the poem we're going to look at, which in its own rather oblique way memorializes that event, is When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom'd, written by Walt Whitman. So maybe we could start, Mark, with Whitman and his relationship to Lincoln.
He adored Lincoln. Lincoln was his kind of vision of the savior of America as the president who started the war when the South seceded, and they had a lot in common, that they were both kind of autodidacts. They had very patchy educations. Whitman left school at the age of 12, and Lincoln, it's thought, had only 1 year of formal schooling. He was born in Kentucky, but the family moved to Indiana, where he spent much of his childhood, and then they moved to Illinois, and it was in Illinois that he started his political career in Springfield. In 1830, they moved to Illinois. And Whitman saw him as somehow rough-hewn, a kind of labouring type, someone who was a kind of saviour figure. And as soon as the Civil War broke out, or fairly soon after it broke out, Whitman went down to Washington, and he would see Lincoln on a regular basis in Washington. In those days, you could get quite close to the president. You know, you could sort of pitch up in the White House and have a chat with him if you wanted to. There's no known interchanges between Whitman and Lincoln, but Whitman invested an enormous amount of energy, imagination in the concept of Lincoln as the savior of the nation. And when Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865, Good Friday. Whitman is in fact in New York at the time, but his good friend and someone he was possibly in love with, Peter Doyle, was in the audience of a play called Our American Cousin, which was about an American dunderhead who comes into an aristocratic fortune in England. Anyway, and Booth shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," this is how all tyrants end. And Whitman was completely overwhelmed and like much of the country, and was completely distraught. And When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom'd shows him coming to terms with this event and reconfiguring it so it becomes almost a kind of symbolic birth of the new America. That Lincoln's death, he becomes a kind of almost like a kind of Christ-like martyr figure whose death becomes symbolic of the ways in which the North and the South can come together again, and the West and the East as well, in some vision of America's future, which didn't develop in the way in which Whitman hoped, obviously in the period after Reconstruction, but this was the ways in which he made Lincoln's death central to his vision of how America could recover from the Civil War and recover its sense of unity.
So he produces a number of poetic responses to Lincoln's death, doesn't he? The first one I gather is called "Hushed Be the Camp Today," which has as its subtitle the date of Lincoln's funeral, which was the 4th of May. And there he's speaking about this event very much in the first person plural, isn't he? "Soldiers, let us drape our war-worn weapons, and each with musing soul retire to celebrate our dear commander's death."
Yes,
that's very much a public poem.
Yes, apparently Sherman's troops all fell silent when they learned. They were kind of jubilant and happy on the way marching to Washington because the war had just been won. Lincoln had been re-elected the previous November. Inauguration speech had happened. That this looked like somehow the North had finally, after these terrible traumas, its might and its superior manpower and industrial might had overcome the South. And there's also a more famous poem called "Oh Captain, My Captain," which becomes the kind of the standard where every school kid in America learns "Oh Captain, My Captain," which Whitman came to detest. And people would say, "Why don't you write more like that?" He said, "If I'd written more like that, I wouldn't deserve to be read at all." So in some ways, he is acceding to popular concepts of what an elegy should look like. But I think that's one genre worth bringing into the mix in relation to politics, is that of the elegy. That when Lilacs Last and Dooryard Bloom'd is possibly Whitman's most famous elegy, or the elegy in which he explores a real death. In As I Ebb with the Ocean of Life or Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, he talks a great deal about death, that death has a huge sort of transcendental or mystical meaning for him. But in this poem, he's attempting to bring together the actual death of his hero with this more mystical vision of death, but also to make Lincoln's death somehow symbolic of all those who died in the Civil War, that there are a couple of passages in which you see Lincoln's murder as almost a kind of a synecdoche for the 600,000 or so soldiers who died in the Civil War itself.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to the poem itself. And again, thinking perhaps about the poem you've just mentioned, "Oh Captain, My Captain." For those of our listeners who don't know it's a dramatic monologue, sort of ballad, isn't it? And it's in the voice of a cabin boy who's the ship on which he's serving has just achieved its mission, and at this last moment the captain has been struck down and is lying dead on the deck. And clearly the metaphor that's running this one is quite straightforward, isn't it? The ship in question is the ship of state, and it's Lincoln as the captain of the ship, the president of the nation, who's been laid low just as success has been achieved, which is effectively the end of the war, I suppose, when Lee surrenders to Grant. When we turn from that kind of idiom, that kind of voice, to the opening of "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom'd," we're in a very, very different imaginative space and imaginative world, aren't we? And it's not just that we're in the world of elegy, as you say, but we're particularly in what feels from the very beginning like the world of pastoral elegy, something like Milton's Lycidas or something like that, that's trying to relate the reality of a death, as you say, in this much, much more kind of almost cosmic way to the energies and appearances of the natural world.
Yes, I mean, in Song of Myself, Whitman posits the ideal American as one of the roughs and a cosmos, to use that phrase. And I think he saw Lincoln as both one of the roughs and as a cosmos. And he adopts, unlike the break with his earlier work, is how allegorical When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom'd is in comparison with, say, Song of Myself, which gives us these very vivid vignettes of life on the streets of individuals and the whole kind of seething mass of mid-19th century America. But in this poem, we have these three symbols, the lilacs that come to stand for the poem, the Western Star, which is a kind of visionary exaltation of Lincoln himself and connecting him with his kind of Western upbringing, and also the hermit thrush, which is a bird native, which he knew of from his growing up in Long Island, the hermit thrush, and the thrush is his version of himself, of the singer. So the lilac, the star, and the thrush are these three symbols which the poem conjugates in various ways, and it makes it a kind of meta poem in a way. It's a poem about its own coming into being, and he's offering us a way of, so rather than describing Lincoln, and Lincoln is never mentioned, though we see his coffin traveling across America as it did on this enormous journey through 10 cities and had 1,660 miles, I think it was. 7 million Americans saw Lincoln in his coffin, and by the end the embalming was not working so well, and he was looking pretty kind of dead by the time he got to Springfield at the beginning of May. So Whitman is attempting to write the national poem of Lincoln's death in an elegy which will somehow bind up the wounds, and therefore he chooses this rather stylized pastoral mode which combines the star, the lilac, and the thrush, and as a way, on one level, of avoiding kind of political antagonism. He's not antagonizing anyone.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do try signing up to the Close Reading subscription. You can sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. Just follow the links in the description.